Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight is a book review. We will be reviewing the book, A Vulgar Display of Power, Courage and Carnage at the Alrosa Villa by Chris A. So this is actually a book that was recommended by friend of the show, Corey Novak. So last year, me and Corey did a case review of the murder of Dimebag Darrell. So this was one of the books that Corey had recommended and he had used in his research that he was familiar with and recommended it. So I read it and absolutely enjoyed it and wanted to share that with you guys. So hence here we are tonight. So my apologies for starting a little bit later, but I hope this is one of those books. It's a little bit different of a book, right? Because it does involve the shooting of a very beloved musician and celebrity. So, but let's see who's here first before we dive in. Russell Hamill, love it. Good to see you. And Kane, I didn't realize it was a competition for who was in here first and second. Tony Stewart, hello. Karen Diamonds, hello. I am well. Cats are well. I thought I shut the door so that none of them were in here tonight. Because it's a little chaotic at the moment. But Loki somehow snuck in here. So yeah, let's hope he doesn't cause the type of terror that his name alludes, which he absolutely does. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started in this. And y'all, let me know in the chat as this is going on. Are you familiar with this book? Are you familiar with this case? Were any of you guys either were or still are Pantera fans? Like, let me know. Let me know. I know, oh my God, it's like Beetlejuice. He literally just came to mind and there he is in the chat. Hey, Paul. I was going to say, Paul, I had talked about this case with quite a bit as well because he was a big Pantera fan. So I know I've spoken to him about the murder of Dimebag Darrell, just kind of like off camera, just getting, someone who was really into Pantera. And Paul is very outspoken about how influential Dimebag Darrell is to him as a musician. So, all right, Paul, no worries. But let's dive in, because if you know your girl, there's a lot of notes. So this book, on the back cover, there's no description about what the book is. Let me show you guys what the back cover is. It's the door at the venue. And you can kind of see here at the very, very bottom, it says R.I.P. Dimebag. And that is very different than the type of true crime books that I read. But right away, I was like, okay, this has I get it. I get it why for this book that would be such an important thing to put on there. And I actually really respect that. So ordinarily in a true crime book review, I'd be like, well, that doesn't make sense, or, give somebody who isn't familiar with this an idea of what the book is about. But based on what this is, even if you're not familiar with Pantera or the murder of Dimebag, hypothetically, and you get this book, like right away, I feel like this gives you enough to know. So I thought that was a very, very good artistic choice. So inside of the book, so right away, before it even gets to, say, chapter 1 of the book, it talks about who this book is written in memory of, which is Jeffrey Thompson, Aaron Hulk, Nathan Bray, Daryl Abbott. So right away, and you can see right on the cover, there are victims there. So again, it has who this book is written in memory of, which I thought was very, very important. And each of these individuals we will get into. Daryl Abbott is, for those who do not know, that is Dimebag Daryl. But Jeffrey Thompson, Aaron Hulk, and Nathan Bray were also 3 amazing men that the book goes through. So we will talk about them as well throughout this. And you at least right off the front know, I don't know who each of these men are, but right away you're hit with their names, and we're going to be getting into that. And this is one of those books that I do want to upfront say was, let me see what date. Actually, I didn't have it in my notes what year this was published. Okay, 2007. 2007. True crime, we have been talking about this, or I have been talking about this for so long, about how there has been a true shift. I keep putting this book in different places. A true shift that the true crime community has been becoming more and more victim-centered, which is the right way, in the way it really, really needs to be. This book being published in 2007, that is 19 years ago, because we're in 2026 right now. It just, ahead of its time, but in the best way possible. I don't know, because I did not pick up this book. This might be more of a question for, Corey Novak, for example, who is very familiar with a lot of the books about Pantera and the murder of Dimebag Daryl. But that's one thing I would, kind of pique his interest in his mind and kind of say, like, when this book came out, I'm very curious. So for any of you who's watching who was familiar when this came out, I just wonder what the reception was about it then, when the true crime community wasn't as much victim focused. Obviously, Dimebag Daryl, yes, because he was a huge musical star and the frontman Pantera, but the other victims, they're not household names. And so for a book to take this angle and be from the get-go victim-centered, again, just very ahead of its time, but in the best way. So for the author, I think that is just, I'm in awe of that was the artistic choice that was made when covering this book at a time when the true crime community really wasn't doing that. It would more so be a book on the offender. So right off the jump, I just wanted to mention that. So the book itself is 340 pages, then divided into 13 chapters. There are a ton of photos throughout the entire book. They are all black and white photos. I started to try to count the pages, and I'm like, I'm just going to stop. When I say so many throughout, I mean, you get pictures of everything that is being described. There are so many pictures of each of the victims, not just Dimebag Daryl, but all of these other men. And I loved that. Not only were these 3 other men who lost their lives that day on the cover, they are throughout the book. As a reader, you really get to know these men who lost their lives at that shooting, as well as the background of Dimebag and leading up to Pantera in ultimately the night of the shooting. But I think it was absolutely incredible that there were so many photos. So you really get a sense of not just what is being discussed, but the people, the location. There's pictures of everything. And I thought that was absolutely, absolutely amazing. So you do get that in this book. In regards to the forward, so it says that right on the bottom, forward by Officer James. I don't know how his last name is pronounced. Nijmeyer. I knew I probably wouldn't get it right, and I know probably Paulcast and Corey are watching this being like, Danny, you're getting it wrong. But Officer James is a huge part of this, and I really like that he gave the forward of this book. I'm not going to recap it because I couldn't do it just. I absolutely could not do it just. So, but it is a very well written forward, and it's emotional to read because he is so, I mean, anybody who was there that night is a victim, like just first and foremost, they are a victim of this as well. I mean, the amount of people that were injured, even if you were not physically injured, the amount of PTSD that comes from this, I mean, it's just horrific. But for this particular officer, it was a mix of his emotion of like, yes, I was the first one there, but also I'm not a hero. And like the most humble man who really, his action prevented the murder of what could have been a lot more people. So I know sometimes people skip like the forewords or like the acknowledgments at the end, like those. I get why people do that. Not with this book. You need to read the foreword. This officer was there. He is part of this. He is a central figure to this. It is worth the read. So, okay. There is one page that right off the jump before we even get into a lot that is at the kind of like introduction part of the book that I wrote. My note just says emotional in all caps. So it's about Officer James's forward. And it's where he says he puts Aaron Hulk, Jeff Thompson, and Nathan Bray as the heroes. He says he was just the opportunity to put an end to the tragic situation. He defines all of the victims from that night to include medical personnel, witnesses in the crowd, those who lost a loved one, and to all those who lost an idol. And again, that does not just sum up what I just said about Officer James. It just, again, he's just like, oh, no, I'm not the hero. These other three men who lost their lives are the hero in addition to. And he's absolutely right. And that's one of the things I know I mentioned time and time again. Anytime we cover a case or a true crime story, when their life is lost in such a tragic, senseless murder or shooting or whatever, stabbing, whatever the circumstance is, people think, oh, there was one victim. No, that one person who lost their life, they have loved ones, they have family members, they have friends, they have coworkers, they have community members. So that one loss of life is tied to so many people who are now victims in this and have to go forward every day with their loved one no longer alive. So to say victim, like it's so many people. And I'm really glad that Officer James says that anybody who lost a loved one that evening is a victim. So, Tony Stewart, what was the killer's name? So, get comfy, stay tuned. We are going to get into that because there's a lot of information about the shooter as well. So we will get into that. So the author introduction. So let's jump in there. The author starts by saying it's the morning of December 9th, 2004, and he was on his way to work. In the radio said, quote, guitarist Daryl Abbott and 3 others were murdered last evening at the Alrosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, end quote. And the author kind of, you read and you feel it off the page where he's saying, I couldn't believe this. Dimebag Daryl, who would want to harm Dimebag Daryl? And he talks about how he immediately I ain't going to work, went home and just, the internet was very different back when Dimebag was killed. But just to kind of get an idea of that, just constant, like what information is out there. And then of course, as the day went on, it was confirmed that Dimebag Daryl was in fact murdered and the shooting at this nightclub did happen. So the author says as the days passed, more bits of the story were made public. including, as Tony Stewart's asking, who the killer was. So the author wanted to learn more about the man responsible for the killing, as well as who the victims were. The author was connected with the families of the victims, and they were kind enough to open their homes and hearts to the author. So that is why we have this book here. And I will say this is one of those true crime books where you read this and you know the author took the time to meet with family members and loved ones of all of the victims in this. And it not just like, oh, I met with them, here's my recap. No, there's so many quotes and pictures that, the family provided for this book. And that's not the case with every true crime book out there. I mean, some of them are, yes, absolutely written from the perspective of people who knew either the victims or knew even the offender. But for the most part, a large amount of true crime books are not having that personal connection to the case. Not to say they aren't great true crime books, but they don't have that personal connection. And this author really, really did his due diligence to make sure that he is giving that to the reader, of not only talking about each of the victims, but going that extra step and that extra mile in getting to know the family and working with the family for this, so that the victim stories are not only being portrayed, but being portrayed correctly and in the most respectful way possible. So now we get into the actual book, chapter 1 through 13. So we learn a bit about the history of the band Pantera. So I know, again, me and Corey Novak covered the case of the murder of Dimebag Darrell. And when we did that, Corey did a lot of research and talking about the history of not only Dimebag, but as well as Pantera. So if you haven't checked that out, go back and check that episode out. So some of this, if you have seen that, might seem a bit repetitive. I'm just going to give a little bit of recap in regards to this. But for more information about the band and who Dimebag was, either go back to that episode, or even better, order the book. Order the book. So in regard to the history of Pantera, some of the things that I noted here was when the band was formed and Phil Anselmo joined the band, there was a huge divide eventually between him and the Abbott brothers. And then that ultimately caused the end of Pantera. And then Damage Plan was formed as a result of that. And the book goes to talk about who was the members of Damage Plan. So April 24th, 2004, there were so many people excited to see Dimebag perform, especially at Bogart's, which is a small venue in Cincinnati. However, there was one person who attended who was not excited to see the band, and that was Nathan Hale. So, Tony, that answers that. So we get that right away at the beginning of the book, Nathan Hale. He was a 24-year-old, 6 foot tall, 6-inch man weighing over 250 pounds. And his mission that night, once he entered the venue, was to get as close to the stage as possible. He believed that Darrell, Vinnie Paul, and Pantera were in his head and were stealing his thoughts and not crediting him. So right away, if you are not familiar with this case, you as a reader are like, okay, there's a lot of mental illness at play with this individual, with the shooter. But the book won't just stop there. It will go way more into detail as the book unfolds. But I think it's nice to know as the reader, like right away, you're like, okay, this is the type of person that we're dealing with. This is the offender that we're dealing with. And I always say, not just here on YouTube, but I say it in real life, if you will. And I actually said it to somebody over the weekend. In what context? I couldn't even tell you. But it was probably true crime related, because like that's all I talk about, true crime and cats. But You already know if you watch the show, you cannot rationalize irrational thinking. From a psychology perspective, you can get very close, but for the most part, just like as an average reader in, consuming, this knowledge and this information or this case, you cannot rationalize irrational thinking and irrational behavior. So again, right away, the author's saying, this is a man with mental illness. In addition, Nathan Hale, he felt he was not only important, but just as important to Pantera as Dimebag was. The author gives you this and then kind of steps back and says, quote, in reality, he was suffering from severe mental illness, end quote. Nathan got on stage, but was initially intercepted by 3 security men. Trying to escape, Nathan grabbed a lighting rack and it crashed onto the stage. There are actual photos in this book. Again, they are all black and white photos of Nathan on stage and different angles from when the shooting was happening, before the shooting, in the middle of the shooting, after the shooting. These are all also photos that are online, but I feel like for 2007, when this book came out, again, a bit ahead of its time in regards to putting like these types of photos in a book, because it really wasn't done as much then. But from someone who was not as familiar with this case until researching it for the show, I'll be perfectly honest, to see those photos, I don't know if you can hear my cat trying to get into that closet. Yeah, I told you Loki was going to be a terror. It was just, it added a different perspective because I'm reading about what's happening, but then also to kind of see the photos like kind of frame by frame as things things were unfolding. I was like, oh my God. Because it's like, I know what's about to happen, but like, if you were there, you do not know what is about to happen. So yeah, photos in the book. So police were contacted and Nathan was facing charges related to trespassing, endangering others, and inflicting criminal damage. So right away you're thinking, wait a minute. He was arrested. There's all these things. Wait a minute. What happened? This was not the night of the actual shooting. So for those who do not know, there was an attempt before. So what happened this particular night at Bogart's was when Nathan Hale got on the stage and tried to attack. Obviously, it was not successful. The thing is, neither Damage Plan nor the venue, Bogart's, were interested in pressing charges. So what happens in that case? The police had no choice but to release Nathan. So the case was now closed and everyone just continued on. So you're left with that at first and you're like, oh my God, that wasn't this night. No, it was not. So now we get into background information. I know cat in the background. I'm fully aware. Loki's just, oh my gosh. As soon as I went live and he stuck out his head from the tower over there, I was like, oh no. So we get background on Nathan Hale's family. So this goes back to his grandparents settling in Chicago, suburb of Roseland. Nathan was the 3rd child of Mary and Gerald. However, when Nathan was born, it was 1 month after Mary and Gerald's divorce was finalized. And the thing was, Gerald refused to actually acknowledge Nathan as his son and accused Mary of adultery. So as a mother, Mary doted on Nathan. He was a good-natured child. He was slow to toilet train, but he was still, for all intents and purposes, a normal child. He was relentless and often resisted sleeping at times. So Mary then met a man in 1980, John Clark. His wife had been in a car accident, so he was a single father to 5 kids. So Mary and John moved in together, and John was great with Nathan. He was an amazing father figure to him. In school, however, Nathan really struggled. He had difficulty completing tasks, and the school tested him several times for learning disabilities, but nothing was discovered. None of them showed anything. Mary and John did eventually go on to divorce. So just a little bit about Nathan's background. So now we get to Aaron Hulk. So Aaron, he was born September 17th, 1975. He was the youngest of 4 kids. He was rebellious, smoking, tattoos, and by in school only by obtaining C's and D's. He worked as a manager at a restaurant and then later as a manager of the diner where his sister and brother-in-law owned. He was complacent and he did turn to drinking. He had a few drunk driving charges, and his mother, even though he lived on his own, basically gave him an ultimatum saying, you need to go to college or join the armed forces. So it was only a few weeks later that he enrolled in the U.S. Marine Corps. He was training to become a vehicle mechanic while in the Marine Corps. He still got to travel, and he was actually first stationed in Hawaii. He got a tattoo that says "Born to Kill" with a peace sign, showing the duality of man. Side note, I love a tattoo with multiple meanings. I myself have several of them that, yep, there's Loki for you, that looking at it, you either don't know what it means, or you look at it and you think, oh, I bet it means this. I have several of those. So when I read that, I was just like, I just really love a tattoo that has dual meanings. It just, something about it just really speaks to me. So while Aaron was in the military, he did use drugs. One of his fellow military friends was actually apprehended for a drug charge and implicated several of his comrades. Aaron was one of them. He was relieved from his duties and instead had to pick up trash and mow the lawns on the military base. During the time of the drug investigation was actually the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attack. Many of Aaron's colleagues were deployed. However, due to his drug apprehension, he had to wait for his discharge papers. Once discharged, he did return to Ohio, but he was very different. He was very withdrawn. He knew enough about himself internally that he knew this dismissal from the military was his own fault. Aaron connected with his high school buddy, someone named Brian, who was an audio engineer for Live Tech. And he admired Brian's kind of wanting to be part of the rock and roll world. So Aaron made up his mind that this is what he wanted. He wanted to be in the music industry also, but from not a musician perspective. He wanted to break into the business, and his hard work, it got him there. He now led the life of a roadie and loved it. That consisted, however, of not being a glamorous lifestyle. Low pay, long hours, and very few accolades. But he enjoyed the work and he loved the lifestyle. And he earned a nickname in the roadie world, and it was Stony. Aaron had recently met a girl named Patty Zink. We learn a lot about her and her relationship with Aaron. He was fond of her and actually planned to bring her to a traditional family Christmas Eve dinner that he was having. We flash forward to Wednesday, in 2004, when Aaron received a phone call from one of his fellow roadies, and he asked him to cover the gig for him that night. Aaron said, yeah, no problem. What's the gig? And it was Damage Plan at the Alrosa Villa. So that is where that book chapter kind of stops for Aaron's chapter. Again, I feel like the author at first gives us each, like we start with like an intro and, get a little bit of information at the beginning chapters. Then it's like, okay, chapter 3 about only about this particular victim. The next chapter is only about that next particular victim, so on and so forth. And then once everything kind of catches up and then we get to the night at the performance at the Alrosa Villa, then we kind of are all on the same page again. But I love, again, this author was ahead of his time, that not only did each victim get spoken about, written about for the reader to learn, they had entire chapters dedicated to them. That was so rare and was not happening back in 2007 with true crime books being out there. And I know I've said it several times during this episode, but I cannot stress enough how ahead of his time this author was with doing that. As a reader, it's not just learning a little bit, a couple of paragraphs about each victim. No. You learn so much that after each chapter, when you go on to the next victim, like you feel like you knew this individual from the beginning of when they were born to be kids, their family background, their interests, what they do for jobs, like relationships, everything. You learn everything. And I love that. As a reader, I love that. So now we are jumping ahead to Nathan Clark. Summer of 1991, his mom was being called from the police by him. He was shoplifting, and this was the first time, to her knowledge, that her son had committed a crime. Less than a year later, in 6th grade, because again, we're talking about a child, he was apprehended by store security, stealing 7 large Hershey bars. Police were called. He had told them, not just like, okay, let's step back. What would you say in this case? I'm sorry, I didn't know. Like, oh no. He says, not only, yes, I did it, I've been doing this every single day for a month. Which I know some people might be watching this thinking, well, Danny, he's a kid, 6th grade, so that's like 11, 12 years old. Like, who didn't steal candy or whatnot? Like, okay, I'll give you that. But he also didn't go on to do what he did. So there's just, again, it's one of those like, was this the predictor of what could have come? No. It's just one of those, of course, in hindsight, when you look back at like cues or things that were maybe what was perceived as innocent, but then in hindsight, it's like, oh yeah, no, that was a bit too abnormal or a bit different than the average. So again, in hindsight, that was one of those moments that, of course, the family still remembers. On April 6, 1992, Nathan was in court and he did plead guilty to petty theft. His mother told the judge about the prior shoplifting, cooperated, and actually asked the judge for help to get her son back on track. That is amazing, because what do most parents tend to do, and from the cases that we cover in this, or family members, not just parents, they try to bail out their loved one. And then we see, like, of course, in hindsight, like all these other things picking up. And then it's like, oh man, but no, not in this case. She was very like, I'm telling the judge about your prior issues and I want help. I want help for my son. So the judge convicted Nathan of petty theft and actually placed him on indefinite probation. So February 1993, so only a year later, Nathan violated probation while committing an act of domestic violence. He was incarcerated as a juvenile offender, and then he was released to the custody of his mother. He violated parole again and was arrested, and then released, returned to his mom. His mother, again, Mary Clark, was concerned and wanted to address why her son was struggling. So a family court probation officer, Marcia Bayless, would become her ally. She had over 20 years experience as an officer of the court, and she helped plenty of juvenile offenders turn their life around. Marcia, after meeting Nathan, felt many of his problems centered on his father's rejection, and that he was a kid who was really looking for an identity. He was a big kid and he had an aggressive streak. Her initial plan was to steer Nathan towards school sports, football specifically. Again, a place to channel energy, right? And what better thing than that? Near the end of 8th grade, Nathan, he was still getting into trouble, however, and he was smoking weed and snorting Ritalin. He was still stealing, and there were a lot of problems at school, just to name a few things. One time at the Gale home, the house was actually set on fire. He told authorities it was an accident. He was cooking, so no charges were filed. Of course, in hindsight, does law enforcement and even the family think that this was an accident? Questionable now. So he would be ordered to court again, and he was sentenced to the care of the Department of Youth Services, a juvenile detention center, because again, he is still under 18. But the court suspended both sentences with the caveats that he obey the mandates of the courts and comply with his probation requirements. As a reader, I'm like, wait a minute. He's on indefinite probation. He does things and is breaking probation and gets arrested and released. Breaking probation, arrested and released. So on and so forth. Let's keep doing this game again and again. So all of this stuff happens. He gets sentenced to the care of the Department of Youth Services. But then the courts, like, follow me on this. Is it me? Am I missing something? Is it me? The courts suspend both sentences, but saying, oh, no, there's a caveat. You have to comply with your probation requirement. He wasn't doing it before, again and again and again. Do we need to do the song and dance again and again? So now it's like, you know what? We'll suspend it. But this time you got to follow. I don't get it. Like, it bothers me because, and I know we're talking about a child here, somebody who's under 18. I get it. But we see this not only with kids, in so many of the cases we cover where people are serial offenders. We see this over and over and over and over again. And it just blows my mind. It blows my mind because what's the incentive to follow probation? You just keep breaking it and then they'll suspend your sentence. Say, just don't do it again. Just don't do it again. I don't understand it, and it's so frustrating. Because again, I get it, we're talking about cases where we're going to know the outcome and it's really, really bad, but nothing was stopped. Again, what's the incentive to behave? It just, it blows my mind. Okay. Yeah, he is every day. So now that I have gone on a rant that y'all, please, if you have any familiarity with this, or just if you are maybe looking at a different way than I am, like, please comment. Or if you're not watching this live, leave a comment on the video and just give me some insight, please. Or even if it's Danny, I agree, or actually no, Danny, I don't, and here's why. Please, I need the engagement in this because it's just racking my brain. Okay, now let's get back to it. So we come to learn that Nathan, beginning back when he was in 2nd grade, so we go back a bit in time in this, and I get why the author did that. It's one of those, like, we get so far and then it's like, all right, no, let's jump back. And I thought it wasn't necessary. I thought it could have just, again, I like a cohesive, like, let's follow the timeline. I didn't, like, I see why the author did, but I didn't think it was something of such importance where it's like, oh my gosh, we need to jump back to this, and here's why it's so critical we do that now. I didn't really sense that, but that's just me. So again, back when Nathan was in 2nd grade, we now learn that he would very often wet the bed, and he was harassed by what he felt were, all right, follow me on this, mysterious, floating, and unrecognizable faces in the dark of night. These voices would tell him he was gay and that he should kill himself. And he dealt with these tormenting voices until he was about 16 or 17 years old. So that's a long time. Again, second grade to about 16, 17 years old. That's a really, really, really long time. When Nathan was 15 years old, he became obsessed with the MTV show Beavis and Butthead. In his mind, though, he was obsessed with it in not quite a normal way. He felt the creator of the show was spying on him and using his life as the basis for the cartoon characters. And that the concept was being stolen from him. And Nathan actually told a judge that in court. And the judge responded with, if he continues to talk nonsense like this, he would be, quote, put away, end quote. So Nathan just simply didn't mention it again in court. That's very troublesome because, again, I was not there in court, so I don't know in what way it was said or how it came across. But of course, in hindsight, like that could have been a moment for the judge to be like, no, there's something's really, really, really not right here. But that opportunity was missed. And instead, like, I feel like the judge's statement made it worse, saying like, if you talk about this or nonsense like this again, we're going to put you away. So what does that force Nathan to do? He's going to still have these thoughts, but now he knows just not to mention it again, which is even more troublesome because now no one knows what is going on in his brain. So when I read that, I was just like, oh no, not good, not good. Again, this was several decades ago. The field of mental health has come such a long way. Not anywhere near it needs to be, but it's come a long way. So I had to kind of think back to like, okay, we are talking about several decades ago in regards to the notion of mental health, but still it was just like, when I read that, it was just like a gut punch. And I was like, oh no, not good, not good. So one day, Nathan's mom was called to pick him up from school. He was acting weird, and she felt that he was high, marijuana. Several students and other teachers that worked at the school, however, they were very concerned about his behavior. He would tell classmates that members of the band Pantera had just visited him at school. Mary, his mother, made an offhanded comment to him saying, "You're nuts, and just stop saying this." So again, what just happened? What does he learn? To become silent and to not bring it up again. That does not stop the thoughts. And I'm not blaming Mary. She is a parent. She is not a professional in the mental health field in the courts. I give her a pass. I don't give the judge a pass. That's just my opinion. So this was a point in time where Nathan was just being sent to a place where his mental inabilities began to manifest themselves in public, because again, he's not talking about it, but they're still there. So he then got to a point where these voices he was hearing and these visions, he was no longer just keeping them to himself. And it really came out everywhere. He got into Pantera at about 16 years old. He became obsessed with their albums. Again, like when you first kind of read this, you're like, okay, well, most kids were obsessed with Pantera, but this goes in a very different direction. Eventually, Nathan's mind convinced himself that he was the inspiration for Pantera. He told his father that his classmates so his father knew this. Of course, he told his mother. His mother said, stop talking about it. But he was also telling kids at school, Pantera, they stole lyrics from me and are using that for their songs. In that, not only was the band doing that, they weren't crediting him for that. So therefore, Nathan was infuriated. So all these people are hearing this. Nothing. Again, everybody thinks it's weird, but nothing's being really addressed. But to be fair, each time he went to court for things and they had the opportunity to get addressed, it was just suspended. So it's like, what do you do? So his mother, the school probation kind of school department, counselors, his probation officer, the courts, they did try to help Nathan. Again, it took kind of a long road to get here, but at this point, he's slipping deeper and deeper into mental illness. So like now at this point, everyone's on board like, oh, we need to help this kid. I think the help should have been sooner, but I digress. So not only was this team of people trying to help Nathan, I mean, it's very clear he suffers from severe mental illness, but he was also using a lot of drugs on top of that: marijuana, cocaine, mushrooms, and LSD. So they have a lot on their plate to work with him. After about 6 years, the Franklin County Court and Marcia Bayless were ultimately relieved of their responsibilities to help Nathan. And Nathan and his mom moved to a different part of Ohio, so he was now under another jurisdiction, and that's where he remained. However, just before his 18th birthday, he acted out again and he was arrested for trespassing. So Mary, again, now Nathan's an adult. I mean, 18, you'd still kind of argue, a young adult, but Mary's beginning to see more and more of this mental illness at play. But not only that, she's seeing more and more of her son's dark side. One time she confronted him about his erratic behavior, and he freaked out in a completely uncontrollable rage, and he actually grabbed his mom and threw her against the wall with enough force to damage the drywall. She did call the police. Nathan was escorted away, but he was not arrested. She had told her son until he cleaned up his behavior, he was not welcome at her home. So he's gone. He now leaves. He is gone. Over the next 18 months, he was essentially homeless and living on the streets. He was arrested several times more for trespassing when he was found sleeping in public locations. In 2000, Nathan reached out to his mom for help, saying he understood that he made mistakes and he wanted to make amends. He asked if he could move back in with her to get his life back on track. She said, you can move back in, but you have to abide by the rules of the house, and there would be no more drug use of any kind and no more physical violence. He agreed and promised to do better. However, within just a few days of moving back in with his mom, Nathan would incessantly pace back and forth in the living room. Mary was thinking maybe he's still using drugs, or maybe it is drug withdrawal. To her, could have been either. He told his mother that he was still hearing voices, and that he still believed he was being watched, and that his thoughts were being stolen from him. So now we begin a new chapter on Nathan Bray. So there are two Nathans in this book. Nathan Bray is one of the victims. So just that's one thing to kind of keep in mind if you're not familiar with this case, that two Nathans, one victim, one is the shooter. Nathan Bray, victim. So now we learn all about him. He was born on February 8th, 1981. We learn about his family background. His parents divorced when he was just 9 years old, and he lived with his mom, but he did see his dad most weekends. He grew up and he was always active into sports. He had a lot of friends, and he shared the love of golf with his father. And he loved taking an interest in his dad's interests, and that did include motorcycles. Nathan was an extremely responsible son. He was really also into rock and heavy metal music. He was 13 years old when he first saw Pantera live in concert. So I feel like anybody, it doesn't even have to be with the band Pantera, but when it was whoever's you can think of in your mind was like that influential in all being just best band you were into. In that moment when you saw them live, it's just one of those, it can't be replicated. You can't go get that at another concert. It's just like, this was my favorite band, and I got to see them, and experience that. And we all have that feeling, right? And Nathan Bray is no different. Again, so he was 13 years old when he first saw Pantera in concert. So he started working at 16 years old. He was a hard worker, and that hard work was recognized, and he was able to move up in his career up several positions. He had saved enough money until he had enough to purchase his own vehicle, and he paid cash for it, a Chevy. Oh my God. You can tell I'm not into cars. Chevrolet Cavalier. Say that 5 times fast, Danny. Oh my God. Chevrolet Cavalier. Done. So Nathan graduated from high school in 2000, and then he entered college at Ohio University in Athens. Nathan met a woman named Carrie in college. They eventually started dating, and they were inseparable. She even started attending concerts with him, listening to the type of music that he did. In December 2001, Carrie discovered that she was pregnant, and she told Nathan. He telephoned his boss, explained the situation, and his boss offered him an immediate full-time position with an excellent salary and benefits package. That is absolutely amazing. Like, not everybody has that type of opportunity, but Nathan did. And he decided to leave college so he could focus on providing for his family. He knew that it was responsibility, and that responsibility started with him. He was going to have a family, and he knew, I need to take care of my family. When Nathan met Carrie's parents, they instantly loved him. Nathan finally got the courage to ask Carrie to be his wife, and she said yes. On August 9th, 2002, Nathan and Carrie became parents to a son named Anthony Bray, and on October 26, 2002, they got married. After their baby was born, Carrie worked part-time, but she eventually quit that job to become a full-time mother to their son, Anthony. After time passed, Nathan did want to go back to work full-time Carrie wanted to go back to work full-time and got a position at a local legal firm. So Anthony went to a daycare at that time. Nathan and Carrie did separate for a while, but they were still together like almost every single day. And they rekindled their friendship, which was something that had been lost over time. And I think it's just kind of reading that just for them to like take that step back as a romantic partnership and then just rekindle the basis, which is the friendship. I just was like, so touched by that in their story. So now we flash forward to November 2004, that Nathan learns that Damage Plan would be playing at the Alrosa Villa. He purchased 2 tickets, one for him and one for a friend. He was hoping he'd be able to beat Dimebag. He called Carrie. He was all excited, and she loved this. He was so emotional about going to this concert, but in like the coolest, funnest way. And she loved that for him. So after that call, he said, all right, I'm heading over to the venue. That's where his chapter ends. We now go back to Nathan Gale, again, the shooter. So after about a year, Nathan, remember, he moved out and then moved back in with his mom saying, you know, I want to get my life back on track. But there were signs that the mental illness was still at play, and that his mom thought either he was still using drugs or maybe detoxing. Things did slowly begin to improve, though, at Nathan's mom's home. There was still the occasional run-ins with the police, but for the most part, things were all right. He was attending a trade school. He was learning automobile engine repair. And he rarely told his mother that he heard any more voices in his head. So to her, it's like, okay, he's on a good track. He's not really saying he's hearing these voices. So things seem to be on the up and up, or going that way. So Nathan's 22nd birthday was actually on the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And he saw this on television, as we all did, right? Of the attack on the towers. While everybody was saying it was a terrorist group, Nathan, however, he's like, no, I know who the real person is behind the terrorist attack. Or not terrorist attack, I should say. To him, rock star Marilyn Manson was the true mastermind of the September 11th attack. The voices, which were still there in his head, but Nathan just didn't tell people about it now. Those voices told him Marilyn Manson brainwashed the Al-Qaeda operatives, causing them to hijack the airlines that day. Many who knew Nathan indicated that he actually expressed a desire to kill Marilyn Manson before the shooting at the nightclub. Again, it's one of those, in hindsight, you kind of piece together it, but at the time, whoever he was venting this to, which again, it says many who knew Nathan. So it wasn't just one or two people that he was saying this to. There were quite a few. And they all just kind of were like, okay, yeah, Nathan. Because of this, because of the attack, Nathan had decided to enlist in the U.S. military, which I know is, for me, reading this, I was like, well, that's a curveball I wasn't expecting. But the thing is, Nathan had to lie on his applications to get in, especially about his drug use. In 2001, the Defense Security Service had a backlog of more than 500,000 military and civilian background investigations. This allowed Nathan the opportunity and the time to falsify his application to just be promptly approved to get into the military. Nathan, on several occasions, while in the military, shocker, would get in trouble with drill sergeants and his fellow Marine recruits. Since Nathan did have technical skills, though, in automobile maintenance, he would repair and maintain Marine Corps vehicles and was an organizational automotive mechanic, which is actually a decent role to have there because he did bring those skills. Nathan did start to do well in the military, even though he was having those bumps along the way. And he was going to be coming home for Christmas 2002. And this is the point for those who know this case where you're like, okay, this is where everything's going to kind of start to change. And if you don't know this case as a reader, you're like, oh no. So when he was coming home for that Christmas in 2002, Mary decided to reward her son in all of his accomplishments. And she went ahead and purchased something that he had expressed to her an interest in getting, and that was a handgun. So she decided this would be the perfect gift to surprise her son with. She paid for the gift, and it was a Beretta 92F. When he came home, she told him, this is what I purchased for you. And December 9th, 2002, they went for him to complete the required documentation to pick up the gun. When he went back to the military camp, he brought the gun with him. Keep in mind, you cannot do that. You have to have authorization to have it in the barracks, and he did not have that. Not only that, he didn't keep his mouth shut. He told fellow Marines that, yeah, I have a gun. I have it with me. So it was then confiscated and shipped to his mother. So what she did is she gets it back, she puts it in a closet and just forgets about it, forgets that it's even there. A few months later, Nathan was telling his fellow Marines that he was having trouble sleeping and he was hearing voices and seeing visions. His behavior was becoming more and more erratic, and he was also becoming increasingly forgetful. Nathan now was receiving several written reprimands for minor violations, but those add up, right? His odd behavior prompted his supervisors to have him evaluated for a full mental health evaluation. When I got to this part of the book, I'm like, finally, somebody is doing something in the mental health field to get something addressed that really needs to be addressed. So the doctors determined he had serious mental problems. He was then admitted to a mental health ward at a hospital. The initial diagnosis was that he was suffering from a psychotic disorder. They observed he was a very disturbed young man. More tests would actually show that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The doctors told Nathan about his diagnosis and explained that he would require medication for this diagnosis. So Nathan did consent to a trial of the drug Prozac as well as Diprexia. Nathan's treatment continued as he was an outpatient for the next 6 months. Nathan then deemed, however, that due to, let me rewind that. The military deemed that because of his condition, he was no longer fit for service in the Marines. So they gave him an honorable discharge. So December 2003, he now returns home to Ohio, and he moved into an apartment that was actually right next door to his mother. His mother was shocked by his return because she knew nothing of it. As far as she knew, he was in the military. Things were going fine. And then all of a sudden, he just shows back up and he's out. So complete shock to his mom. He did tell her about the mental evaluations and about the schizophrenia diagnosis. This now made perfect sense to Mary about her son. And yeah, it was one of those things just began to click. Nathan then got a job now that he was back home and needed to provide for himself. And he was working at a place called Minute Lube. He was a very, for all intents and purposes, a good employee. In January 2004, Nathan, however, decided to ask his mom about that handgun. She told him it's on the top shelf of the closet. That night, he went into the closet and took the gun. So it's just, again, as a reader, I'm like, no. So, quote, despite his recent discharge from the Marines and his struggle with mental illness, Mary Clark never considered that her son could be dangerous or pose a threat to anyone. End quote. I think that part of the book, just again, it stuck out to me that I wanted to include it in this review. I think it says a lot, and on many levels, because again, we as outsiders, especially we as outsiders who know what the end result is, of course, are just no, how could she not see this? At the end of the day, even when a loved one has mental illness, you don't think that they're going to get to that level of dangerous necessarily, or that they would pose a threat to anyone. And she didn't believe this of her son. And besides that physical altercation that they had the night where she did call the police, a lot of his other things and charges were not for assault. They were for other, maybe more, not to say that stealing and all the drug use and all those other things aren't criminal, but nothing to the point where, again, besides that one physical altercation they had, nothing that kind of aligns with that. So, and again, she is not responsible for her son's actions. I want to put that perfectly clear, even though I don't think that the purchase of a handgun for somebody who suffers, especially again, in this case, we know the outcome with such severe mental illness. It was tough again, but I don't falter. He did the actions that he did. So Nathan began to also frequent a place in the area. It was a tattoo parlor that was across the street from his apartment. The staff and the patrons, they came to know him, but they all agreed that he was very, very creepy. And again, he frequented there all the time. Nathan, y'all, this is something that mental health field, if you work in it or if you know someone, it's just this is one of those stories that's we hear it time and time again. He was doing okay and felt he was doing okay. So he stopped taking his antipsychotic medication. And when he stopped taking them, the voices started to return. So now we go to April 4th, 2004, and Nathan drove to Damage playing concert at Bogart's. Again, that was that first concert we talked about very early in the book, right? So now we're up to here with the book. He had planned to confront Dimebag and Vinnie Paul, like we mentioned, and he got on stage, but he was tackled by security. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the book, the venue and the band did not want to pursue charges, so ultimately Nathan was released by police. Over the next few months, Nathan tried out for an offensive lineman position on the Lima Thunder, and he was notified that he did make the team. So this, again, quite a jump in a contrast to kind of what just happened, right? In June, he quit his job at Minute Loop so that he could devote his time to playing football. Meanwhile, Nathan was borrowing money every single month to use for ammunition because he really enjoyed using that gun and really enjoyed target practice. On December 8th, 2004, Nathan slept in that day. And that day, when he did wake up, spent time cleaning his gun. He then went to the tattoo shop asking to buy equipment, and he got mad when they told him no, so he left. And that night, around 8 p.m., he drove to the Alrosa Villa. So we're going to jump back to another one of the victims, Jeffrey Thompson. So as you can kind of see based on kind of the structure and how I'm doing this here, and it's the way the book is laid out. So there'll be a chapter about one of the victims, then it goes back to the shooter, Nathan Gale, and then a chapter about another one of the victims, then it goes back to the shooter, Nathan Gale. So there is a lot of information about the shooter, and we learn that kind of as each chapter unfolds, we get more and more of his history. With that being said, like, I think I have kind of mixed feelings on that structure. I think it, on the one hand, it breaks it up. So you're not just reading like maybe 4 straight chapters about the shooter. So it's like you're reading something where you're just like, oh gosh, we know how this is going to end. But then there's all these little pieces that when you connect it, you're like, okay, it kind of makes sense. But then you can kind of put your mind at ease and then read about just, you know, one of the victims, then back and forth. On the flip side, reading about each of the victims, I was very touched by the way the author did it. And again, I really, when I would close out that chapter, I felt I knew the victims. I felt a connection to them. And to go, you know, the author could have done it. And it still would have been a great format where it was, you know, chapter victim after victim after victim. But it kind of separated it so they didn't get lost with each other. Like they each had their moment. And then you could go back to learning more about the offender and then go back to a victim to give them their time. So structure-wise, it could have gone either way. The way it was formatted, great. Or it could have, you know, had the author decide to focus on maybe just the victims at first, then just the shooter, and then get back to the night at the Alrosa. Could have gone either way. But I found it interesting, the artistic choice that the author did it that way. And for myself, I kind of, again, took it as I can really focus on each victim and give them what's just for them. And then let's go back to the offender and then learn a little bit more of the puzzle. So again, now we are at victim Jeffrey Thompson. And we learned about his family background. He was born September 21st, 1964. His parents divorced when he was 6 years old, and he went to live with his mother in Georgia. He then ended up, after some time, moving to Arkansas with his father. He joined the Boy Scouts of America, and he was growing fast, like physically growing fast. By about 13 or 14 years old, he was over 6 feet tall, which is crazy. 6 feet tall at that age. Crazy, right? In the fall of 1983, an argument occurred between him and his father, and Jeffrey decided to move out. So he drove to Dallas, Texas, and we learn in the book how he got to see his mother 2 more times before she died of cancer. Of course, something like that is just, it's horrific. It's just horrific. The book talks about how he didn't speak to his dad for 8 years. Jeffrey reached out, however, after his mom died of cancer, and they reconnected. Jeff got into Renaissance portrayal acting, and I smile because, like, it's so cool. It's so cool in the way we learn about it, and it's just, yeah, there's pictures of him doing it, and it's just like you see the pictures about it, like how truly happy he is doing it, and you read about it, and it's just like, wow, like that's what he just loved to do and did it. It was cool. So he was a bigger guy, as we talked about. His big size and enthusiasm got him the role of bodyguard to the queen. That's where he met a woman, Linda, and they became best of friends. She was the owner of a Dallas-based talent agency, and she was able to find opportunities for him to audition for roles. Anytime a studio needed kind of quote unquote a big guy, he was the perfect fit for that. And he actually did end up appearing in a few nationally broadcasted commercials. In 2001, Jeff started doing security at clubs and at bars. He ended up landing a part-time job as part of a promotional team for 2 DJs. And this gave him the opportunity to meet rock stars and attend concerts for free, which, I mean, how cool is that, right? Through the band Drowning Pool, Jeffrey met Vinnie Paul and Daryl Abbott, and they hired him for various chores in addition to driving their limo. The brothers took to Jeffrey, and they actually even invited him to their homes, introduced them to their families, associates, and he got to travel with them. So Jeff met Sharon Bradley, and she became the love of his life. But they only stayed as close friends, and she ended up marrying another guy in November of 2004. But again, stayed close best friends. Meanwhile, while that was happening, Jeffrey had said that the last 2 years was gaining greater exposure to the business of working for rock and roll bands. So that was happening for him. And he received a call from the road manager for the band Damage Plan. The band's chief of security had basically was strapped down, and the Abbott brothers wanted to know, okay, well, we know Jeff. Can he take over the final leg of that tour for the 2004 North American tour, which would be from October to December? Jeff immediately said yes. He called Sharon to tell him the good news because, again, best friends. However, this meant that he would miss her wedding, but she encouraged him to go and to do this because she knew how important it was to her best friend. So he said yes. So later on in the book, we learn a bit more of how the Alrosa Villa itself came to be. So I'll just go over a little bit about that. In 1973, it was a lounge, and it was struggling, and it was eventually sold off. The new owners named it the Alrosa Villa. They had never run a club before, but they had a passion for music and was confident that it could provide a place for locals to rock. After a bumpy beginning and, kind of that initial of taking over something and starting anew, I mean, that's just hard enough in itself, right? But they became known as being the first place for like rock culture. They got a lot of bands to play there. Of course, at the time, big names, but like in hindsight, talking about it now, like all these years later, these are still name bands where you're just like classic. Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, Black Leather Touch, just to name a few. So in 1981, the owners expanded the venue because originally it could only hold 141 people capacity. The renovations that they did now made it so they could hold 600 people. So, I mean, quite an improvement. The owners got the opportunity to hire Damage Plan for the December 8th, 2004 show. They only had 1 month's notice, however, to promote the show and to hire opening acts. Local bands, they were jumping at the opportunity to open for Damage Plan, specifically to open up for Dimebag Darrell. That day, the band members went outside to meet fans the day of the show, took pictures with them, signing autographs. A lot of those photos are actually in this book, which it's like really cool. But and then it's also just like, oh my gosh, that was just hours before everything was about to change. So We're getting there, folks. So the night of the concert, about 9:30 p.m., the band members of Damage Plan slipped into the venue via the back door, and that was being monitored by Aaron Hulk. Then the band went downstairs towards the dressing room. There were 3 opening bands that night for the show. Damage Plan was to go on stage at 10:30 p.m. So Aaron Hulk, shortly before Damage Plan went on stage, he switched roles from roadie to security member. He was an asset to the security at the venue. His role was to monitor the backstage door. It was an easy enough task, and it gave him an excellent view of the concert. In the audience, Nathan Bray was there and his friend, because remember, they had 2 tickets to go. They were having a great time. They worked their way to the front row on the right side of the stage. Jeff Thompson was there as the band prepared to go on, was using Dimebag's personal video camera, filming around the backstage area and pointing the camera at the audience. Jeff sat down the camera and placed it on top of the amplifier. Jeff then stood in the middle of the stage, did a scan of the audience. The Alrosa's 10 security staff, they were positioned in different areas of the building. There were at least 3 security staff in the front of the stage. So for all intents and purposes, everything was security-wise where it needed to be. Outside, however, Nathan Gale was there and he was lurking. He arrived around 9:15 p.m. He had to move his car as he tried to park it near the entrance to the main lot, but security told him that that spot was reserved. So he moved his car willingly, without incident. What security didn't know, though, was he was carrying his concealed loaded Beretta 94F 9mm handgun, a spare magazine, and 30 additional rounds of ammunition. He wandered outside for a while. At 9:45 p.m., a parking lot attendant walked past Nathan Gale and asked if he had a ticket. He said he did, but he had no interest in the opening acts, and that's why he was hanging out outside. The parking attendant would later say that Nathan Gale was pacing back and forth, smoking, and was acting suspicious. But he saw that behavior at almost every single show he worked. So it was like one of those things that was noted, but then was also not out of the ordinary as well. So at this point in the book, I'm going to, because there are 2 Nathans here, I'm going to describe victim Nathan as Nathan, and then Nathan Gale, the shooter, by his last name, Gale. Okay, so Nathan victim, Nathan Gale shooter. Okay. So Jeffrey Thompson was center stage as the concert was about to begin. The lights went out and the band was then on stage and ready to go. Jeffrey grabbed the microphone and said, quote, "For the love of God, are you ready to get this shit started? From the land of For Here They Are, Damage Plan," end quote. The lights came on and Jeffrey exited stage left. The band's first number that they performed was Breathing New Life. That's when Gale outside made the decision to bypass the entrance. He hopped the fence to the other side of the patio. The parking lot attendant from earlier, he noticed this, and he immediately ran to the venue door to notify security that there was just a man who climbed the fence and was trying to enter the venue without a ticket. So in his mind, it was something that simple. There's actually a picture in the book of the fence in the patio that he jumped, and then the door where Gale entered to get into the venue. There is also a map of the venue, and it was really cool to see that map there because we're hearing about the layout, but to see it, it's just, it makes it a very different perspective. So again, map of the venue, and it actually shows the path and viewpoint of Nathan Gale from that pit. So it kind of gives that interesting twist to it as well. So security was saying to Gale, quote, "Hey, no, you don't do it, man. Like, again, don't jump in there. You don't have a ticket." Like, again, they thought it was something that simple. But Gale just kept walking. He was a predator making his way to the audience. Gale approached the stairs to the elevated VIP section of the right of the stage, with security trailing a few steps behind him. Gale went up the VIP stairs. Security were still following him. This was only, so just to keep a time frame, and this is something we're going to touch base on as the rest of this book unfolds and the rest of what happened unfolds, is the timing of everything, because everything happened so fast. This was 86 seconds into when the band was introduced. So just keep that in mind. Band was introduced, only 86 seconds has now passed. About 4 seconds later, Gale then started running as he crossed behind the PA speakers. He was now on stage right. He ignored 2 band members, the bassist and the vocalist, and they were playing very, very close to him. This is when Gale went straight towards Dimebag. He held the gun, stretched out his arms, ready to shoot. Dimebag Darrell was completely unaware of Gale's presence. And I have a note here. There is a photo in the book of Gale with his gun drawn towards Dimebag. It's just like, oh my gosh. I can't get that vision of that photo out of my head, because it's like split seconds before everything was about to change. Vinny was playing drums. And for those who don't know, Vinny is Dimebag Darrell's brother. So Vinny Abbott. He was playing drums, but at that moment, he saw a, quote, blue blur, end quote, as Nathan crossed the stage directly in front of him. Gale grabbed Dimebag's hair with his left hand and yanked his head towards him. Jeffrey Thompson was on stage right and immediately ran at Gale when he saw him on stage. Jeffrey grabbed Gale's shoulders, trying to pull him off Dimebag, but Dimebag reached up with his right hand, trying to escape Gale's grip. His hand was between his head and Gale's handgun. And then the book says, quote, but it was too late, end quote. Gale squeezed the trigger, the barrel of the gun only inches from Dimebag Darrell's head. The bullet struck Dimebag between his ring and middle finger, exiting just behind his thumb. The bullet then struck Dimebag in the side of his head. Jeffrey then threw Gale to the stage floor to stop the attack. Gale's glasses fell off, and that limited his vision. That is very important, so just make note of that. His vision is now impacted. As Gale fell, he pulled Dimebag towards him, and he fired the gun again. And this bullet struck Dimebag in the cheek. Once on the ground, Gale placed his gun directly on the back of Dimebag's head and pulled the trigger. This last shot is what killed Dimebag Darrell instantly, and his body fell onto his own guitar. Jeffrey still tried to use his body as a shield between Gale and Dimebag, and now a band manager, Christopher Paulcast, drum tech John Brooks, and the Alrosa security member Ronald Jenkins. They now ran onto the stage to help Dimebag and Jeffrey. Christopher Paulcast reached to grab Gale, and Gale raised his gun and fired it at Christopher. And there's actually a photo of him holding his chest after being shot. That is in this book. Ronald Jenkins, realizing that the gunman was still shooting, leapt off the side of the stage to avoid being shot. Gale was still firing that gun, and he lunged at Jeffrey, pushing him back so he could get to Vinnie Paul. This is when Dimebag's guitar technician, John Graham, pushed Vinnie Paul to the ground, using his own body as a shield to protect Vinnie. Gale then turned around when Jeffrey re-engaged him, and this allowed Vinnie Paul the chance to escape. So I know right now I'm going into like kind of like a step-by-step as everything's unfolding. I'm just, as much as I'm doing that, I'm only giving like, I feel like in a nutshell of it. The book goes into it a lot more in detail. So Jeffrey at this point seemed to have the upper hand against Gale, until Gale blindly pointed his gun over his right shoulder and pulled the trigger. And what are the odds? That shot hit Jeffrey in the upper right chest. His body reacted and involuntarily lessened the grip that he had on Gale. Jeffrey was now very severely injured, staggered away to the side of the stage. And this is when Gale went up behind him and shot him. And this shot severed Jeffrey's carotid artery. Jeffrey fell to the stage unconscious and mortally wounded. So John Brooks, again, ran to the stage towards Gale. He just witnessed his friends being slaughtered and he disregarded his own personal safety. He launched himself at Gale, grabbed his gun, and wrestled him to the floor. This is when one of the vocalists, Patrick Lockman, who was on the left from the stage with a microphone in hand, screamed to the audience this was not part of the show. And he yelled, quote, "Call 911, somebody fucking call 911," end quote. While this yelling into the microphone was happening, that this is not part of the show, Gale and John Brooks were still fighting, and Gale struck John's head with the gun. So now John was injured and he actually became a hostage. They were on stage behind Dimebag's 3 towering stacks of amplifiers. So Aaron Hawk, we talked about him a lot earlier in the book. He worked security at the event, and he grabbed a beer bottle and began to advance towards Gale. John was, again, hostage to Gale, but he was not staying still, and he was trying to resist Gale as much as he could. When John put his hand over the edge of the gun, Gale actually pulled the trigger on the gun, and the bullet passed through John's hand and into his leg. Gale took this opportunity it's like it impacted John so that Gale could then take John hostage again. But this time actually was able to get the gun pointed at John's head. Several members of the Alrosa security team had advanced to the stage now to confront Gale, because again, everything's happening in like seconds. In the audience, Nathan Bray was there, and he was watching, just stunned at what was unfolding. He felt he couldn't just stand by there, so he began to yell Dimebag's name and advanced to Dimebag Darrell and tried to render aid, trying to perform CPR on Dimebag. Another audience member was trying to check Dimebag's pulse. Then so sad, they quickly all realized that he was already lost. Dimebag Darrell was deceased. But again, think of these people advancing the stage to try to help those injured, including Dimebag Darrell, putting themselves at risk because the shooter's just right there at the side of the stage too. Once those trying to render aid to Dimebag realized he'd already passed away, they then went towards Jeffrey Thompson. Again, he was unconscious on the side of the stage, and they were trying to assist him. That's when Nathan Bray looked up and saw Gale emerge from the back of the amplifiers with John as a hostage. Nathan stood up to Gale and said, quote, "Man, what are you doing?" end quote. Gale responded by raising his gun towards Nathan, and he fired. And he was only 3 feet away when he fired that gun. The bullet went into the center of Nathan's chest, exiting out his back, and went straight into Jeffrey's leg. Quote, for reference in time, this all occurred under 2 minutes. And the book makes it that point to say that this occurred under 2 minutes. After Gale fired at Nathan, the gun jammed, and that was not lost on audience members. They noticed this, but Gale was very, very quick to fix it. He had military training, so he knew what to do. So that didn't really allow for audience members or anybody else to take over the situation. But Aaron Hulk made the decision to act. He cautiously waited for the opportunity to strike at the shooter. John, still being hostage in an attempt to break free, grabbed Gale's gun, trying to yank it out of his hand. His hand struck the magazine release button, and the magazine dropped to the floor. The gun was jerked away from John by Gale, and Gale pulled the trigger, and this bullet struck John below his arm in the right side of his body. This now meant that the weapon was now out of ammunition, and those who were on stage, like in close parameter of what was happening, they saw this and they started yelling, quote, "He's out of bullets, he's out of ammo," end quote. Aaron now realized he could make a move and he rushed Gale. The thing is, Gale calmly, and it's like right when I read that word calmly, I was just like, oh my God, like anything but. Gale calmly reached in his pocket and pulled out a loaded magazine. He put the magazine in the weapon and then fired 2 shots at Aaron. One bullet went through Aaron's hand, striking him in the left thigh, breaking his femur. The other bullet went into the left side of his chest. Aaron fell to the ground, and that's when, it's like so horrific. Gale approached him and fired 3 shots at him, basically point blank range. So in the meantime, while all this carnage is still unfolding on stage, the patrons and the Alrosa staff, they moved Dimebag's body off the stage to the left side of the sunken dance floor. Several people surrounded his body. Many, it's like they knew he was passed, but still tried to render aid. Again, they knew it was true, but it's like, what do you do in that situation? You try and you're in shock. So they thought it was too late, but still thought we're going to render aid just in case. There were others, however, that just held his hand and held his body. And the book describes, and I actually wrote at this part, like an emotional part of the book, they're holding his hand, touching his body, and there's just a growing pool of blood that's coming from Dimebag's body. And just, they're all there. And it was the way the author wrote it, like it was one of the most emotional part of the books that I read. Like, it was just heartbreaking because you can just visualize it. And yeah, horrific. There were audience members who also were turning their attention to Jeffrey and removing him from the stage. At this point, sirens started to become heard as first responders were now arriving to the scene. Gale, however, was still on stage holding John hostage, and he realized he was in a position that he had no way out. So he went back and forth between pointing the gun at John's head and pointing the gun at his own head. In comes Officer James, who did the foreword that we talked about earlier. He is someone that we now get to learn about in the book. So it's like we learn, okay, he's now on scene, but let's step back a little bit and learn a little about him, which I really found helpful as a reader. And like, he's been a law enforcement officer for quite a while. So this is an experienced gentleman, an experienced officer. And here he is the first one to arrive at the scene. But let's talk about that a little bit. So he had been a Columbus police officer for almost 5 years. In the night of the concert, he was just starting his normal shift at 10 p.m. when a call came in saying that there was a shooting in progress at the venue. When he arrived on the scene, people in the parking lot immediately were screaming to him, "He's still inside. He's still shooting at people. This is for real." And that's a quote. He's still inside. He's still shooting people. This is for real. The people outside were extremely helpful to the officer. They let him know there's only one shooter. He's at the left rear of the stage, and he was wearing a blue jacket hockey jersey. They also let him know, the officer, the best way to get into the venue to get to the shooter. So amazing. I mean, that the officer's getting this much incredibly valuable information. Imagine if he didn't know that going in. Like, so many of those details each are super, super important to that night. And if he wasn't aware of even just one of those, things could have just played out very, very differently. So once Officer James got inside, he was able to get a waist view of the shooter. This is when he also noticed, however, that the shooter had a hostage. So the officer moved towards the shooter. Luckily, remember, earlier we talked about Gale's glasses being knocked off, limiting his vision. He did not see the officer. He did not see Officer James approaching because things were now blurry. So, I mean, small miracles, right? So Officer James was now approximately 20 feet from Gale. And as far as Officer James knew, he says, I didn't know. I could have been the only officer in the building at that time, as far as he knew that, right? So he rose up from behind the speaker, leveled his weapon at the shooter's head. He had to be careful because Officer James says if he didn't place that shot correctly, he could accidentally kill, wound the hostage, or even a bystander. So that shot was a super important shot to take. As the officer was taking his position, Alrosa security staff, they wanted to take a chance to distract the shooter. They were yelling at him and waving their arms from the front of the stage, urging him to surrender. At this time, however, there were 5 other police officers who entered the venue from several sides of the doors with their guns drawn as well. But again, Officer James didn't know this at the time. This is when Gale noticed an officer by the front of the stage. Gale then tried to put the weapon to the side of John, the hostage's head, to kill him. But in those split seconds, Officer James knew he had to act immediately, and he just fired his weapon. In this shot was the shot that struck Gale directly in the center of the forehead, while another shot pierced his shoulder. Officer James fired 6 more shots that struck the shooter in the face. Nathan Gale was killed instantly. And there's actually a photo in the book of Nathan Gale on the ground after being shot. In total, this entire rampage that I just described, again, and I'm just giving like the little in a nutshell pieces, this lasted 4 minutes and 59 seconds. 4 minutes and 59 seconds. I cannot get over that. Let's take a moment to pause. Everybody breathe in, breathe out. I just threw a lot of horrific information at you guys, to be perfectly honest. Again, if you're familiar with this case, it's not a surprise. If you're not, I'm fully aware. I just threw a lot of very graphic information at you guys of how this played out. Again, in 4 minutes and 59 seconds. So, okay. So now Officer James went to approach Gale to make sure that he was in fact dead. And that's when he realized for the first time that there were other police officers in the building, and they also cautiously approached Gale as well. They wanted to get the weapon away from Gale in case he was still alive or in case he was faking injury. They moved the weapon and then assessed, and they were confident that Nathan Gale was in fact now dead. Once that happened and they had to secure the scene, and first responders were now cleared to enter and attend to the victims. Officer James right away, again, he's had his experience in career in law enforcement. He knew his actions were going to be investigated. So right away, one officer took his gun and escorted him out of the venue. Officer James, his weapon was now part of evidence in this crime scene. The Columbus Police Department officer support team would now come to take over for Officer James. This was protocol anytime a police shooting occurs. So while all this kind of like behind the scenes thing is happening in regards to the officer and what their protocol is, now we're back at the scene in the book to the other victims besides Dimebag Darrell, right? Nathan Bray. He was found semi-conscious and seriously wounded. As he was being attended to, his vital signs indicated that his body was fighting to live, but it was failing fast. They had to transport him to the hospital immediately, and Nathan actually flatlined on the way to the hospital, and he was pronounced dead upon arrival. Aaron Hawk's body was moved to the center of the stage. Officers and concert goers, oh, that was so Boston, concert attendees. They tended to him. He was unconscious. He was gravely wounded. And his girlfriend actually walked towards the stage because she was there. She let out a scream when she realized that the lifeless man being attended to was her boyfriend. Aaron passed away despite the best efforts of the first responding officials. John Brooks, he was the man who was held hostage. He went to the damage plan tour bus because he was seeking aid. He would survive, and the book talks about he was thrilled to be alive. And the wording in that, I get it. I mean, he just went through hell. Everybody in that building went through hell. But to have that, like, I'm just so happy to still be alive considering what just happened. And he, for all intents and purposes, very easily could not have. I think that just goes to show, like, because we see it play out with so many mass shootings or, public shootings where survivor guilt is so real. It's so real. And we still hear about it all the time where, especially I tend to read about it more with school shootings where there's someone who survived and maybe was so gravely injured, but then they feel such survivor's guilt that they end up either killing themselves down the road or just in an emotional trapped place of depression and PTSD because of what occurred. Not to say that he did not go through that and other attendees didn't, but for that note to be like, I survived and I am thrilled that I survived this. It was just one of those, like, yeah, like, I hear you, John, I hear you with what you went through. Like, breathe in, breathe out. You made it. But not everybody there in that nightclub did. Chris Paulcast, he had a gunshot wound to his chest and he was transported to the hospital. He did go on to survive the shooting. Jeff Thompson, let's go back to him. CPR was being performed on Jeff Thompson. He was transported to the hospital where he had been continuously receiving CPR. The hospital, they tried everything they could to save him. However, he was pronounced dead at 10:50 p.m. Let's jump back to Dimebag. There were still some people in that venue that were still attempting CPR on him. Medical personnel, again, when they arrived, they completely took over. The monitoring system confirmed that he had no vital signs. There were other indications that, quote, incompatible with life, end quote, prompted the medics to request an unseen supervisor to make the call. And in that moment, Dimebag Darrell was pronounced dead at the scene. He was most likely, the book talks about he was most likely dead before his body even fell to the floor of the stage. So ambulance cruisers placed him into a gurney for transport. But police officers advised the ambulance crew that no, this body was now part of a crime scene. So the crew, oh my gosh, I didn't know this happened. And in hearing this, I'm like, oh my God, I'm reading it like, oh my God. The crew was ordered to place his body back on the floor as where they originally found him, which makes sense. It's to maintain the integrity of the crime scene. But envisioning that play out, I'm like, oh my God. Oh my, it's just horrific. All the way around horrific. So most patrons, okay, this next sentence I'm about to say really just gave me hope for society because think of what they just went through and all witnessed. And most of them remained on the venue premises because they wanted to assist law enforcement authorities. They wanted to provide eyewitness statements. That, I think, just goes to show the community of the music field, as well as their love for the band and for Dimebag Darrell, that they wanted to stay and do everything, most of those patrons, as they could for law enforcement. They could have easily left. They wanted to do the right thing. And it just, when I read that, I was just like, as much as like my heart was breaking in this part of the book, as a reader, I was just like, wow, there are good people who want to do the right thing here. And it just, that little bit of hope and positivity that I was able to get as a reader at this part of the book. Flipping ahead now, my heart sinks again. Vinnie Paul, Dimebag's brother, once the venue was secure, he actually wandered back into the main hall of the venue. He saw people kneeling around his brother. As he got closer, those people tried to protect Vinnie, pleading with him, get back, stay away. Vinnie retreated to the lounge area and asked someone to check on Dimebag. When he asked one of the detectives about Dimebag, the detective pointed to the body on the floor, and it was just like not in the best. This was not handled right. Basically confirmed right there that Dimebag was dead. Vinnie Paul, this was how he learned about his brother's death. He instantly called Dimebag's girlfriend, who was Rita Haney. It's just like now word of mouth, just, I mean, wildfire, right? It was just spreading quickly, and to Pantera's family about what happened to Dimebag. Moments later, the phone at the bar rang. It was Phil Anselmo. He received word of the shooting and asked to speak to Vinnie Paul. Vinnie Paul said he had no interest in talking to, quote, that son of a bitch, end quote. And that message was passed on to Phil, and then the phone hung up. Vinnie Paul was now being interviewed by police about what he saw from his perspective, because, again, he was on stage when this happened, and he did this while holding on to Dimebag's guitar. And that was the guitar that his brother had been holding at the time of his murder. This part, oh my God, was so sad. After the interview, police told Vinnie Paul that they needed to take the guitar as evidence. Vinnie pleaded with them, like, please let me keep this guitar. But law enforcement said, no, we have to take it. There was somebody, thank God, who remembered to tell police about the small video camera that was on stage that had been recording the show. Remember, we talked about that at the beginning of this night unfolding. That little camera being set, and that was recording. That camera was going to be huge, invaluable evidence for law enforcement about what happened. Now, at this part of the book, it discusses each of the victim families' members being notified about their loved ones being murdered at and shot and killed at this venue. My note here is just in all caps, and it just says heartbreaking. This also includes Nathan Gale's mom being notified. Nathan Gale being the shooter. Again, she is not to blame for anything that her son did. And I consider her a victim in this. Again, she is not responsible for her son's actions. I do not like that she bought him a weapon, but at the end of the day, he made the choices that he did. Yes, he was severely mentally ill. But again, and I'm very outspoken about that. Anytime there is a shooter or an offender, their family who had no part in this, they are victims as well. society doesn't kind of always see it like that. I think it's coming around now for that. But I do consider her a victim in this. So now, okay, I have a lot of little notes here as I wrap this up for you guys. So chapter 13, remember the last chapter in the book, because this is 13 chapters. It is titled Cemetery Gates. All I'm going to say about this is this chapter made me cry, like cry. It was so well written and just so emotionally grabbed you as the reader. I didn't expect, I mean, I was sad throughout at different parts where I'm like, oh, that's emotional. That's emotional. I got to chapter 13 and just lost it. Like, oh my gosh. And it takes a lot for me to even, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it takes a lot for me to even shed a tear, just even in normal life. And then I think reading true crime as I do so often, I'm used to reading about the most horrific things and I can kind of compartmentalize when I read it. This just grabbed me, just completely grabbed me, that chapter. Yeah. So I'm not even going to begin to describe it because, yeah, no, we don't need Danny crying. The book talks about at the end, Nathan Bray, he was the first to be laid to rest. And there is a photo of his grave in the book. 2 days later, Aaron Hulk was laid to rest. There is a photo of his grave in the book. The following day was Dimebag's funeral. So we do learn a bit about that. It was a private ceremony with only family and close friends. Some of those close friends were celebrities. Eddie Van Halen, he put a guitar that he had built for Dimebag in the casket with him. Dimebag's public memorial was at the Arlington Convention Center later that day. Many people attended, including fellow musicians, celebrities who actually spoke of him. It was a memorial filled with music, words, laughter, tears, and alcohol. Vinnie Paul made sure everyone who attended knew that his brother had always given his all for his fans and had gone down doing what he loved. Phil Anselmo. He flew in to attend the funeral, but he was told he was not welcome. I will say, side note here before I continue, that is one of those things where in doing the research when me and Corey Novak covered this case, and then me kind of, talking with like Paulcast and just like, again, because they're huge fans who know so much about Pantera and the background with this. And just come to learn from them that like Phil Anselmo is one of those people have a lot of different opinions on him. And outsider looking in, I find that whole thing very fascinating. Yeah. So I have like my own little opinions on that based on like a bit of the research that I've done, which again is different than like somebody who's been a fan following this band for like, as long as they did. But I just find that whole thing very, very interesting. So just a side note. But then the book continue on. 2 days after Dimebag was laid to rest, Jeff Thompson was laid to rest. And there is a photo of his grave in the book as well. And who does that leave? Nathan Gales. His memorial was taking place in Marysville, Ohio. It was low-key. It was discreet. It was out of the public view. Only his mother, brother, and a few close family members were even present. There is no headstone and no monument for him. The very end of the book now, it is filled with memorials, and that is actually what is titled. So it's just tons and tons of writings about the victims, not just Dimebag, but Jeffrey, Nathan Bray, Aaron Hulk, pictures, just so much in there. In fact, the families of Jeffrey Thompson, Nathan Bray, and Aaron Hulk, they actually wrote something for the book and contributed, and it's in here. So you got to read like the family's own kind of contribution to this book about telling their loved one's story, which was just, oh my gosh, heartbreaking, but also just uplifting, knowing that their loved one was going to be portrayed in such a respectful and honoring way. And again, I said it before, I'm saying it again, especially in 2007 when the true crime community, books were not written like that. So yeah. The family of Dimebag actually declined to be interviewed for this book. Couple final notes here. What the families wrote about their loved ones at the end. My note was, it was beautiful, raw, vulnerable, heartbreaking, full of so much love. And then below that I wrote, I cried again when I read this section. So I just threw a lot of information at you guys about the book. I have a few critiques, but of course, overall, I'm talking about this book because I highly, highly recommend it. So because I keep it real, I will go from what those critiques are. Okay. My biggest critique is there is different font throughout the entire book, but not only throughout the entire book, even on the same page. And the reason being was that the format, depending on where you are in the book, it was clearly strategically done so that the words in the format would either stretch or minimize to fit the page section. So what I mean by that is, for example, this page with some of the victims, right? Like right here, it's cohesive. It's cohesive. The way the structure is the same, the format, the font, that is similar. But if you go to even like 2 or 3 pages later, it's completely different. And it is so that it then fits fits the page based on the pictures on the page. I've never seen a book do that. Again, when I read books to do reviews, when I buy a book, it is for me to enjoy as a reader, first and foremost. If I love it and want to recommend it, then I will reread it and do a review where I'm a lot more critical because, again, I'm reading for a different purpose the second time around. So as a reader, it did bother me a bit because I'm just like, wait, what is happening? Why is this format this way? Why is this font on this page different than the one 2 pages later? And why are these, like, the words were stretching to just fit that? It was weird. So from a critique point, when I reread it, oh my God, couldn't stand it. From a reader perspective, it was distracting. At best, it was distracting. And I didn't feel the structure, the format needed to be that way. And I've never seen that in another book, as I said, but there's that. The author, you could tell that the author is not, so I say my wording, not a regular author, meaning they're not somebody who's published, all these books and this is just the next one talking about this case and a line of 20 more they have coming out. That's not what this author is. Like, this author is somebody who this case and this performer touched them so deeply that they wanted to do more and read more and educate more. This individual Chris A could have done the research and made those connections with victims' families for himself, just as a fan or whatnot. But to take that and share that with people, to share who these other victims were, again, when you're reading the book, it definitely does not come across as somebody who is an experienced author who writes books all the time and knows all the commonalities of things that should be present in a book, right? but I liked that it wasn't like that. I was truly reading somebody who was just writing a book for the sake of being passionate about it. Like just really from the heart. Like I absolutely loved that. It made the book more raw and more vulnerable. And you really felt that the author was doing this because they had a true passion for the artist and for what happened that night, and wanting to make sure that that was told, and that the victims were given, their just moment, so that people knew who they were too. Let's see. Yeah, my note that in addition to that was that it came across that the author did this because they really have a passion to do it. So, but I can say on the flip side, I could see how what for me was like a really catching thing because of that. I could see how that might be a con for somebody else reading this book, is that it's not as traditionally written as most true crime books do, because it doesn't have that kind of professional feel and touch and structure and format to it. So I viewed it as a pro in reading this, but I could see how somebody might read it and take it as a con. Overall, I absolutely love this book, and I am so grateful that Corey Novak had, not only when we did and covered this case, he knew so much about this case, but then did a lot more research on it, but took the time to say, Danny, you need to read this book. So I did. And Corey Novak, thank you. This was absolutely an amazing book. I am so glad that I got it and so glad that I read it. I recommend everybody get and read this book. Even if you are not a fan of Pantera, Damageplan, or even that, maybe that type of musical genre is not your thing, that's okay. This is still an amazing book, an amazing story, and amazing justice for giving all of the victims here and for those involved their moment. And you really, as a reader, got to feel that you knew who the victims were in this. Their names and their lives aren't being lost in what happened. And it shouldn't be like that. Sometimes the true crime genre has a way with just remembering the names of the offenders, but here this book really makes it a point to remember the victims in this and make sure they are front and center. And I think that's absolutely incredible. And the author did an excellent job doing that. So that is my review. That is my review for tonight. Again, A Vulgar Display of Power, Courage and Carnage at the Alrosa Villa by Chris A. So everybody, I hope you enjoyed this review. If you have read this book, please leave a comment. Let me know your thoughts on it. I would love to hear what you thought. If you haven't read this book, but there was something that you took away from this, again, please leave a comment. Let's engage. I would love to chat about it with you. And then if there's any other questions on it, just let me know and I will gladly answer as best I can from this. So thank you for joining. There will be no True Crime and Chill at the end of this week, as I mentioned during last week's True Crime and Chill. So no show later in the week. So everybody, enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy the rest of your week. I will see you all next week for another show. Remember, until next time, everybody, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.